I was present in Israel very shortly after the attacks. You could smell death. If Hamas had not been stopped on October 7th, they would have carried on October 8th and the 9th until you would have had the annihilation of not just the Jewish state, but most of the Jews in the state.
I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series where we explore the pros and cons, the challenges and opportunities of classical liberalism in the world today. I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Bret Stephens, who is a presently renowned columnist with the New York Times, but has written also for the Wall Street Journal, and for 2 years was the editor of Jerusalem Post, and also won Pulitzer Prize. Bret, welcome.
Good to be here, Rob.
Welcome to Australia. You were just telling me beforehand why you're disappointed in Australia. Could you share that with me?
Well, I'm not disappointed. I was only joking that my childhood introduction to my idea of Australia were the Mad Max films, and this is my second visit, and you haven't lived up to those expectations.
Well, I hope we never do, frankly. Before I get going, we need to clarify something, which is a confusion in the English language between the word liberalism Australia and liberalism America. In the US, the word liberalism means progressivism?
No. I mean, it's funny because the semantic confusion begins very quickly. Most Americans would use liberal to describe a certain kind of political tradition that has its roots in the Roosevelt administration's efforts to expand the scope of government, and that political tradition carried on by Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society, by the Kennedys, including the younger Kennedy brother Teddy, in expanding government programs and carrying on through President Obama. And that is distinct from various strands of American conservatism, but also increasingly today, American liberals feel that there's a gap between their liberalism and the progressivism of the farther left of the Democratic Party or the Democratic Socialists. But there's also a different sense of liberalism, which many of us who think of ourselves as classical liberals believe in, which is liberalism as a political order or a regime with the idea of liberty, both personal or political and economic, at its core. So this is not a liberalism that goes back to FDR. It's a liberalism that goes to John Stuart Mill and the founding fathers of the United States, and the political tradition of Locke and David Hume, from which they came.
And that liberalism is concerned about the growth of the state, not encouraging the growth of the state.
To a degree,
yeah.
Yes. I mean, it is concerned about the growth of the state, and there's some people who are, there's again a spectrum of opinions. So in the United States, the libertarians who are associated, say, with the Cato Institute in Washington are probably the most alarmed by the growth of the state. There is another strand of a classical liberal who sort of made peace with the basic contours of the welfare state, but wants to rein it in and at least minimize it. That's more of a Reaganite tradition in American politics.
So is there a word to describe those kind of liberals?
Yeah, conservative.
Conservatives. Because in Australia, conservatives are distinct, though overlapping liberals, and even people like Friedrich Hayek wrote a famous essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, speaking as an economic liberal. He was thinking of the conservatism of European conservatism, I suspect, of crown and altar conservatism.
Yeah, and it's important to maintain these geographic distinctions alive. And of course, before Hayek came to the United States, he was an Austrian, or England, he was an Austrian liberal. And one reason why the term conservative actually, I think, is a useful and intellectually coherent one is that what an American conservative is trying to do is conserve a political order that is found fundamentally and foundationally liberal. That's to say, the political ideas that are inscribed in the Declaration of our Declaration of Independence in 1776, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is what the American conservative wants to protect against what you might say is the innovations of one variety or another of progressivism. But that conservative would also say that in order to protect that foundational concept of American liberty, you need a set of institutions that are not themselves liberal. For example, intact families help produce responsible citizens and moral people. So the family is not a liberal institution in and of itself, but it helps liberalism. Businesses are not liberal institutions, they're hierarchical institutions. A boss can fire you, you have employees who are at will, but a thriving economy and a culture of enterprise helps undergird a liberal society because it produces citizens that are capable of exercising liberty responsibly. So it's a very distinctive tradition, and as you said, it's different from European conservatism. It is not of the throne and altar variety. It's much less concerned about the grip of the past and of tradition and of a sense of culture or nationality than the European conservatives might be.
And that seems to be because, quite distinctly from our country and many others, there is this founding document. There is this set of ideals that the founding fathers put down, which, despite all the inconsistencies in practice, was nonetheless a liberal document.
I think it's probably the most liberal political document ever conceived.
There you are.
It's if you look at the American political tradition, the great question in the early republic is whether the United States is founded in 1776 on the basis of the moral claims of the Declaration of Independence, or in 1787 on the basis of the legal covenant, which is the Constitution of the United States. And one of the important philosophical claims that Abraham Lincoln made, most famously in the Gettysburg Address, but throughout his life, was to insist that our real founding was in 1776, that idea that we are created equal and that the political order is conceived in liberty, as he put it in 1863. Yeah. That is radically important to America's sense of itself, that we're not just a compact of states that have essentially made a deal to accept various forms of government and a federal order, but that we represent a moral claim. And so that liberalism becomes more than just a question of politics. It enters into a realm of the ultimate purposes of human nature.
Does the moral claim give America a certain sense of exceptionalism?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, we think so.
I know, of course you do. I was trying to be polite.
Yeah, well, I know. I'm sufficiently self-aware that I know that this sometimes grates on the sensibilities of others, and I do think that America should think of itself as exceptional, because at least at the time of its founding, there was nothing quite like it, and because of its general success, not uniform, but general success, it is something new under the sun, and radically changed the way in which politics has been conceived around the world.
At the time, many thought it would never work. They thought you can't run a society, a republic, stably for any long period of time. It'll immediately go into tyranny. That's what.
Well, that's right. And the founders were acutely aware of the shortcomings of ancient democracies, which sort of rose, had brief periods of stability, and then became prey to demagogues. And maybe that's what's happening to us now. But so far, it's taken about 250 years.
I'll come to that just
not
a moment.
Shorter period.
Can I just? One thing I've noticed in America today is there's an awareness, as is around the world, in liberal democracies, of the fact that, as well as these wonderful moral claims, there was a significant immoral behaviour.
Oh, sure.
I'm thinking of slavery.
And more than slavery, also the
expulsion of
the terrible, terrible treatment of Native Americans.
Yes, indeed. Is there not a claim that somehow these realities delegitimise the moral claim of of the American liberal enterprise.
Of course, that claim is often made. There's a wonderfully redolent line in Bill Clinton's first inaugural address in which he says, "There's nothing wrong in America that can't be fixed by what's right in America." And I always thought that was a lovely and profound turn of phrase, because what the United States really is a society that is more acutely concerned about its future than it is about its past. And we have the benefit, because of the Declaration of Independence, that we can resort to our foundational documents to help relieve and end the evils of our time. So Lincoln, to end slavery, rebuked his critics by pointing to the Declaration of Independence. How, he said, could you endorse the idea of slavery when the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths and so on, and talked about, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, among these rights, and so on. A century after Lincoln, almost exactly a century after the Gettysburg Address, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and again said that the founders had offered a promissory note to all Americans, including African Americans, and that note had not been redeemed. So social reformers in the United States have been able to turn to the Declaration to rebuke the bigots of their day. And I think that in itself is a rebuke to those who say, well, the founders were just a bunch of hypocritical slave owners who didn't mean a word of what they said. I mean, to some extent, of course, that's right. There's hypocrisy in any generation, and greed and avarice and so on. But they did set down in their foundational document a set of ideas that eventually led to the liberation of the very people they themselves had enslaved.
Would it be fair to say they were sincere in what they meant, but they had a blinkers on? In other words, I don't think they were hypocrites in the sense of they didn't mean it. They meant it, but hadn't realised what they were meaning.
Well, I think all of us, maybe not you, but many of us at all times there's a gap between our aspirations for ourselves and the behavior to which we would like to hold ourselves and the way in which we actually behave, right? I mean, I would love to lose 20 pounds. Hasn't happened, but at least in my mind,
we're on a unity ticket here.
So, but at any rate, you don't say that an idea is false, for instance, by simply pointing out that it's being espoused by a hypocrite. The idea can be true, and the behavior can fall short of it, and that was certainly true of the founders. What matters is that the idea itself has a lasting moral claim.
How important is the created equal?
Yeah.
How important is that? We've not mentioned the role of religion yet. We've mentioned family and business. But how important for America is the notion of created? Or can that survive in a completely secular atheist worldview?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it can survive, but it needs. I mean, I think what you're driving at is whether a liberal order requires, at least at some level, a kind of a quasi-religious basis.
Some transcendent.
Some idea that
not just purely immanent, some transcendent backing. Otherwise, it seems arbitrary. That's all.
Right, and maybe that's the case. But whether it was created equal by a Christian God, a Jewish God, or some other God is another.
I'm not judging there. In fact, the question is, it may be that it was needed to come up with the idea, but the idea somehow can have a life of its own, perhaps not entirely consistently as it goes on. I'm just aware that the notion of the Judeo-Christian concept is often invoked as a foundation of liberalism.
That's why I think of myself as more of a conservative than a liberal. I'm using these terms in the ways I described a few minutes ago. In the American sense, in that it is probably the case that the liberal order is in fact greatly strengthened if there is at least some kind of baseline conviction that we are made in the image of God, and so we are endowed with a kind of human dignity, that is unalienable, as the Declaration says, and can't be altered by historical circumstances or changes in technology or anything else. That conviction absolutely strengthens the basis of a liberal order. Now, can you do it without it? Yes, you can, but I think it's probably harder.
Yes. You mentioned that liberalism is not the whole of life, and understood in the Wyoming term, but it requires other institutions and bodies. You mentioned the family, business, possibly other bodies. If you try and make liberalism the way of life, it becomes very hollow.
If you try to make liberalism
just liberty and freedom.
You know, I think about that, and I think it's a very interesting question. V.S. Naipaul, the great novelist, in the early 1990s gave a wonderful lecture in New York, and he talked about the immensity of the idea of the pursuit of happiness and how much those three words contain in terms of a sense of ambition, personal purpose, the fact that the pursuit of happiness is at once an utterly universal ideal. We are each pursuing our happiness. Aristotle tells us that. But at the same time, it's totally subjective. You're pursuing your happiness in a way that's obviously distinct from mine or anyone else's. And he talked about how much this contains, not only in terms of our ability to create lives for ourselves that are distinctive and authentic to our innermost being, but it's also an idea that's incredibly capacious, that it includes everyone from every skin tone, religious conviction, whatever. And what Naipaul was able to communicate in that speech, and I'm not doing it justice, is that this purely secular idea may or may not be ultimately an adequate idea, but it's a very powerful one. I think the claims of liberalism, not just for political reasons, but also as possibly a morally fulfilling idea, are not hollow. I mean, they have to be thought through. This idea of experiments in living, which we get from John Stuart Mill, leads to lots of crummy experiments, right? But it also leads to lots of wonderful experiments and ways of leading a life that those of us who dress like this might sometimes have reason to admire.
Looking at America today, I'm sure you agree, people would not be, they would be excused by being disappointed, perhaps I might say, in how it's going at the moment, looking at your top leadership in particular. Can you just explain a little bit what's going on? Is this a long-term malaise, or just one of those things that happens from time to time? You get two old men. I'm thinking of the coming election at the end of this year, and I, at a distance, I don't want to judge either, but it seems to me, and to many of us, a disappointing situation.
Oh, well, imagine how we feel.
You're living it.
You're seeing it at a distance of many thousands of miles, and we're living it. The answer to your question is, of course, I don't know. No. Right? We'll find out, and we'll be able to say in 20, 30, 40 years what this means. At the most superficial level, you have two characters who happen to be quite elderly, one of whom is a kind of a cult of personality figure, the former president. The other of whom is a kind of establishmentarian incumbent whom nobody dared to challenge or seriously challenge in the primaries. And it's probably a one-off. It's unlikely to be...
It's not the sign of a deeper failure or a deeper malaise.
Well, it is the sign of a deeper failure. I'm just not quite sure what that failure is.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can say maybe the failure is that we have a primary system that allows the more rabid partisans to determine who the candidates are going to be. And unlike in Australia, we don't have universal required voting. So
that's an illiberal phenomenon, you might think, forcing people to vote.
Right, but it maybe it produces better outcomes.
I think it does.
I mean, I don't know. But
I'm not excited about our leadership either, so let's not get carried away.
well, everything is a matter of comparison, right? So that's a proximate cause, that the wrong people are giving the broader electorate the choices that they have. Another factor is that I think what you might call the habits of a free mind have atrophied in recent decades for various reasons. I think there's been a collapse in civic or education in civics. I mean, it's astounding how little Americans know about their own history, their own traditions, political traditions, their own system of government. So that's one function. I think a second function is the rise of social media. Every time there's been a revolution in communications technology, it has tended to lead to political upheaval and often the rise of demagogues. The last great revolution in this kind of technology was the radio, and who was the most avid practitioner of radio politics? Well, it was a certain Führer of Germany who made sure that every German had a cheap radio in his home so that the Führer could speak directly to the people without the intermediary.
It also led to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ability to speak to his people directly as well.
Right.
Which led to an increasing position of the president.
Right, and television, and now we have social media. Okay. And what is Trump's preferred medium? Well, until he was booted from it, it was Twitter, which we now call X.
Great fun. Can I change topic a little bit midstream? One thing about the United States of America is it's all people, all men and women now, of course. And therefore, although it has a strong ethnic focus, English speaking, it's a way in which, when we admire this looking on, there's the melting pot concept of America, different all sorts of background, races and cultures still identifying as America on the whole. Mm-hmm. You're over here in Australia giving us an address here for the Centre of Independent Studies on the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And you are a defender of the State of Israel and I'm no doubt concerned with the present situation. At the time of recording, the Hamas-Israel war is still raging. So I want to ask you the first question is, have you any idea how it's going to end?
Well, I have some ideas, but prediction is very difficult. It is a fluid and dynamic situation, and I hate being asked for predictions, which might turn out to be bad ones and soon prove bad.
Well, to put another way, is it a moral war being fought by Israel?
It's an existential war being fought by Israel.
Tell me more.
If Hamas had not been stopped on October 7th, they would have carried on October 8th and the 9th until you would have had the annihilation of not just the Jewish state, but most of the Jews in the state. I was present in Israel very shortly after the attacks. I visited the kibbutzim in the so-called Gaza envelope. What I saw was a charnel house. Even 2 weeks after the event, you could smell death, thick. You could smell death in the buildings. Women were systematically raped, gang raped, brutalized, tied to posts, mutilated. And any country attacked this way would respond with exceptional force, because no country can allow this to happen to its citizens or allow the perpetrators to get away with it. To just give you a sense of scale, you obviously know how the United States, with Australia as an ally, responded after the attacks of 9/11. But proportionally, because Israel is a country of not quite 10 million people, proportionally the death toll in Israel on October 7th, the 1,200 who were murdered, is the equivalent of 15 9/11s happening in a single day.
Wow, I never thought of that.
Given America's population. So imagine a 9/11 not just in New York and Washington, but also Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, and so on. And imagine also this, by the way, not just a plane going into a building and keep killing people at random, but terrorists going into homes and beheading farm workers, raping women in huge numbers, shooting fathers in front of their children. I don't think that anyone who hasn't thought that through can easily make the claim that somehow Israel has no right to pursue the course that it's following. You can argue about the wisdom of the tactics, and that's a fair argument. But I don't think you can argue about not just the right, but the duty Israel has to defend itself.
You use the word existential. Looking on from a distance, I have the feeling that Israel has been through a series of crises, all of which, if they win, they survive. If they lose, it's all over. In other words, Israel must fight to exist. I'm thinking we're going right back to 47 and onward.
Well, that's just the thing. Other countries lose wars, and they lick their wounds, and they rise again. The aims of Israel's enemies from the moment of its creation haven't been limited to the defeat of Israeli forces. It's been aimed at the end of Israel as a state. And what Hamas wants is also what Iran wants, and they say so. It's what Hezbollah wants, and they say so. It's what the Houthis want and ISIS. And then you can go back in time all the way back to the original aims of their opponents in the wars of 48, 67, 73.
This may seem a silly question. What is Israel? You say it exists in a state. What is the essence of that state existing?
Israel is the state of the Jewish people.
Right. So that's the key component, state of the Jewish people.
By the way, there's a debate on this subject.
Yeah.
Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Israel is the Jewish state. A more religiously minded person would say Israel is the Jewish state, which is to say that it has to have, by law, distinctly Jewish components. My view, a more secular one, is Israel is the state of the Jewish people, the state of the Jewish people, but not defined by Judaism. And that's a very much a live debate within the country today.
I believe so. In fact, I believe there's been a shift. When it was first founded, it was very much for the Jewish people and often
right.
quite
It was Ben Gurion's idea,
yeah.
which was a much more secular idea.
What makes it the state of the Jewish people? What's distinctive about that compared to the state of the Sikh people or the Indonesian people? It's yes.
Well, look, I mean, different states are founded on different principles, but most states in this world are conceived as nation states. That's an idea that goes back to, as an idea, you can say it goes back to the early 19th century, maybe late 18th century. Yes. And it found its kind of efflorescence in the late 19th century and then in the 20th century. But many states are conceived that way, states that emerged from, say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Denmark is the state of the Danes, and not just the state of the Danes, but the state of the Danish church, right? I mean,
yes,
if you're a Dane, you pay a tax, I don't know exactly what it is, but you pay a tax to the Danish Lutheran Church, and it has certain privileges and advantages. Germany, when after the Cold War, it decided that it was going to repatriate ethnic Germans who had been effectively stranded in Russia for well over a century. Why did the Germans favor ethnic Germans, right? I mean, presumably they were Soviet citizens or something else, but the German state did.
So that example shows that there's also a dark side to national states.
There's always been a dark side to national states.
With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the violence that occurred as different nations wanted to have their own states, went on right until recently with the collapse of Yugoslavia. There can be a dangerous side in us nation, not that nation.
Of course.
Yeah.
Look, Robert Lansing, Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, said something to the effect that the nation state, which of course Wilson was advocating at the Versailles Conference, was a phrase written in dynamite. I think that's a good phrase. That was the term the way he expressed it, or a phrase loaded with dynamite. And that, I think, was right. The idea of the nation state automatically has a kind of us-them quality in it. Now, the question then is, well, does it delegitimize that idea? And I would answer, no, it doesn't, because many states have a good reason to believe that ethnic or religious or other cultural norms unify a people and create a sensible basis for political sovereignty. And the question then is, within the framework of the nation state, how much room is there for liberty? How much room is there for pluralism? How much room is there for difference? Are the rights of other minorities honored, or are they not honored? It's perfectly possible to live as a Muslim or a Jew or something else in a, say, Catholic state like Spain, and you recognize that some privileges, small and invisible ones, aren't quite as available to you as they might be elsewhere. I mean, King Charles III, right, is not just the head of state of the United Kingdom, he's the defender of the faith, right? So the Anglican Church has a privileged position.
Yes, indeed, we do. Actually, I admit this, I'm a retired Anglican bishop,
Yeah.
but we call it the good old days when we had the whole show to ourselves.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
Well, but no one would say that Britain, as a result, is an illiberal state.
No, in fact, I can't confide this, but I think that in some cases, other religions entirely un-Christian are pleased that I believe are pleased that the king, who's very tolerant of other religions, nonetheless is a religious figure in some way, gives them more comfort in the place. My question on national state is, can a national state be a liberal state?
Sure. And most national states are liberal states.
But don't you have to compromise liberalism in order to favour one particular ethnos?
You're always look. There's no purity in politics. Okay, you're always compromising liberalism to one degree or another, and politics has to conform to history and reality. History meaning certain people feeling profound attachments to certain pieces of land, not just the Jews with respect to the land of Israel, but you know, the
Danes,
Croatians, the Danes, you know,
yes,
the Portuguese,
Japanese,
and so forth and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, provided that within that context there is a broad scope for liberty. By the way, the American model, which is e pluribus unum, out of many one, right, also has tensions and problems. There's no utopia in politics.
Is America a nation state then?
No,
it's not.
America's founded on a very different
a
very different concept.
In fact, where we started, on these ideals,
Right.
not upon a national identity.
Yeah, although there are many conservatives who would argue, many right-wingers, I don't know if you'd call them conservatives, but many right-wingers who would say, well, we should be, in a sense, a nation state. There is now an idea of Americanness, which makes it a distinctive nationality, and we should enforce that idea in one way or another. And you know, I think of my mother, who arrived in the United States in 1950 as a refugee speaking no English, and I'm glad that the more liberal idea prevailed against the narrower ideal.
Well, here in Australia, we call ourselves a multicultural state,
Yeah.
which means, I guess, we're saying we're not a nation state.
Well,
Or else we're confused. I suspect the latter is more likely the case.
you know, you would know better than I.
No. But I mean, the concept of multiculturalism is itself a decision to at least severely qualify the notion of national identity.
Well, multiculturalism, again, you know, this is a concept that, you know, if multiculturalism means that I'm going to have an English breakfast, sushi lunch, and dinner, you know,
Indian.
Indian
That's me.
for
That's
yeah,
me.
sure, tikka masala for dinner. That's great, right? I mean, we're enriched that way.
That's
You
my
can think
menu,
of,
you know.
of all kinds of. We can think of all kinds of multiculturalisms, which fit very comfortably within
That's not what I mean.
a
of
liberal
course.
order.
Yeah.
But a different kind of multiculturalism would be, for instance, if you are, say, Muslim and you want a divorce, you would seek it not through civic institutions, but through an imam, and the restrictions that would be imposed on your spouse would be religious. That's a different kind of multiculturalism.
And that's where the rule of law is being qualified.
Right.
And there are states in the world where whether you're Malay or Chinese or Indian does affect very much the rules you live under.
Yeah,
For example,
and with I mean, you mentioned Malaysia with preferential treatment for one group against
Yeah.
another.
Is that the case in Israel?
To some extent it is, and that's a problem for Israel. Look, anyone who's been to Israel knows very quickly that Israeli Arabs are full citizens, even if they are I don't want to call them second-class citizens, but there's definitely a lower...
Qualified citizen in
Yeah,
some
they're
way.
qualified. There's no question they're qualified, and Israel can do a lot more to integrate them into society. By the way, just as the French could do a lot more to integrate its Muslim community into France. Then the larger question, though, is not about the state of the status of Israeli Arabs in Israel. They are members of the Knesset. They sit on the Israeli Supreme Court. A quarter of positions at the University of Haifa, these are figures that I have it more or less in my head, are Arab students. They're citizens, and I think they're proud and loyal citizens. The question that you're really asking pertains to the Palestinians.
Yeah, and they are not citizens of Israel.
They're citizens of the Palestinian Authority,
Yeah.
which is a quasi-semi-state that Israel has been trying, and Israel and the world has been trying to midwife into existence for a long time. But it's a little bit like a case of conjoined twins, Siamese twins. The operation to separate them runs the risk of killing them both.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note,
Oh, was that it?
we must draw our conversation to a conclusion. Thank you very much, Bret. It's been most illuminating.
Thank you.
And quite helpful, in fact.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have talk with Bret Stephens in this edition of Liberalism in Question. I'm Robert Forsyth, and this is a production of the Centre for Independent Studies. Thank you for watching.